You're standing on a dusty battlefield in the scorching heat of the Holy Land, the year 1187. The ground trembles beneath your feet as thousands of hooves thunder across the desert sand. What you're witnessing isn't just another medieval skirmish. You're about to see military tactics so devastating, so precisely engineered for destruction that they would reshape warfare for centuries to come. The Crusaders weren't just religious zealots with swords and shields. They were the architects of the most sophisticated killing machine medieval Europe had ever produced. A war machine so effective that it carved through the Middle East like a blade through silk, leaving Islamic armies scrambling to adapt to tactics they'd never encountered before. But here's what most people don't understand about Crusader warfare. These weren't desperate holy warriors charging blindly into battle, praying for divine intervention. Every charge, every siege, every formation was calculated with mathematical precision. The Crusaders had turned warfare into a science, and their enemies paid the price in blood. Over the next few minutes, we're going to break down exactly how the Crusaders dominated battlefields across 3 centuries. You'll discover the tactical innovations that made Islamic chroniclers refer to them as Iron Men and Men of Steel. We'll examine the specific techniques that allowed relatively small European armies to conquer and hold territory thousands of miles from home against overwhelming numerical odds. The foundation of Crusader tactical superiority rested on one devastating concept that would define medieval warfare for generations: the heavy cavalry charge. But this wasn't the chaotic horse rush you've seen in Hollywood movies. This was precision engineering applied to mass destruction. Picture this. You're an Islamic foot soldier standing in formation outside the walls of Antioch. The morning sun glints off what appears to be a wall of steel moving toward you. 200 fully armoured knights, each weighing over 300 pounds with their gear, mounted on massive war horses bred specifically for combat. They're moving at 20 miles per hour in perfect formation, knee to knee, lances couched under their arms like the spears of some mechanical death machine. The physics alone were terrifying. Mass times acceleration equals force. Each knight represented roughly 1,500 pounds of steel, flesh, and horseflesh, moving at the speed of a modern car. When that force concentrated into the point of a 12-foot lance, it delivered kinetic energy capable of punching through shield walls like they were made of paper. But the real genius lay in the coordination. These weren't individual warriors. They were components of a single weapon system. Contemporary Byzantine scholar Anna Komnena, watching these charges in action, wrote that a Frank on horseback could make a hole through the walls of Babylon. She wasn't speaking metaphorically. She was describing the systematic destruction of infantry formations that had dominated Middle Eastern warfare for centuries. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Islamic chroniclers described seasoned warriors freezing in terror at the sight of a Frankish cavalry charge. The thundering of hooves, the glint of steel, the perfect discipline of the formation. It broke enemy morale before the first lance found its target. Many battles were won before they truly began, simply because opposing forces couldn't maintain cohesion when faced with this overwhelming display of coordinated violence. The Templars perfected this tactic to an art form. Their cavalry charges became legendary throughout the Islamic world, not just for their effectiveness, but for their terrifying precision. They developed specific formations, timing strategies, and coordination signals that turned the charge from a simple attack into a surgical strike capable of shattering armies 10 times their size. But the heavy cavalry was just one component of a much more sophisticated tactical system. The Crusaders had mastered something that most medieval armies struggled with: combined arms warfare, the integration of different military units into a single, devastating whole. A typical Crusader army looked like this. At the core, you had the heavy cavalry, the knights in full mail, the shock troops designed to break enemy lines. Behind them, a much larger force of infantry armed with spears, crossbows, and shields. These weren't just supporting troops. They were integral components of a tactical machine. Here's how it worked in practice. The infantry would advance first, forming protective ranks with their shields raised. Crossbowmen would loose volleys of bolts into enemy formations, disrupting their cohesion and creating gaps. When the moment was right, when enemy lines showed signs of weakness or confusion, the infantry would part like a curtain. Through these gaps would thunder the heavy cavalry, hitting the enemy at their most vulnerable moment. This coordination required training, discipline, and communication that most armies of the era simply couldn't achieve. The Crusaders had developed command structures and battlefield signals that allowed complex maneuvers under the chaos of combat. They could adapt their tactics mid-battle, respond to changing conditions, and maintain unit cohesion even when taking heavy casualties. The crossbow represented another technological edge that gave Crusaders devastating advantages. While Islamic armies relied heavily on traditional composite bows, requiring years of training to master, the crossbow could be operated effectively by soldiers with minimal preparation. More importantly, crossbow bolts could penetrate armor that traditional arrows couldn't touch. During siege warfare, crossbowmen positioned on walls or behind fortifications could deliver accurate, armor-piercing fire that devastated attacking forces. The weapon's mechanical advantage meant that even relatively weak soldiers could generate enough force to kill heavily armored opponents at significant range. This leveled the playing field in ways that fundamentally altered siege tactics throughout the region. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Crusader tactics was their approach to siege warfare itself. They didn't just surround cities and wait for starvation to do the work. They had turned the art of capturing fortified positions into a systematic science of destruction. The Crusaders deployed siege engines that dwarfed anything the region had seen before. Massive trebuchets capable of hurling 300-pound stones over castle walls. Mangonels that could rain down death from distances that rendered defensive archery ineffective. These weren't just weapons, they were psychological instruments designed to break the will of defenders before the actual assault began. The sight of a giant trebuchet being assembled outside your walls sent a clear message: surrender now or face systematic annihilation. Chroniclers describe defenders abandoning their posts simply upon seeing these massive engines of war taking shape in the distance. The construction process itself was a form of warfare. Crusader engineers would deliberately position these massive machines within sight of the defenders, working slowly and methodically to maximize psychological impact. The rhythmic hammering of construction, the gradual assembly of wooden frames that grew larger each day, the careful calibration of counterweights, each step was visible to those trapped inside the walls, counting down to their inevitable doom. But the stones weren't the worst of it. Crusader siege masters developed tactics that modern observers would recognize as early biological warfare. They would load their trebuchets with diseased animal carcasses, rotting human remains, and containers of burning pitch. The goal wasn't just to breach walls, it was to spread terror, disease, and despair throughout the defending population. The city of Nicaea fell to these tactics in 1097. The defenders, watching massive stones rain down on their homes, while the stench of rotting flesh filled their streets, surrendered rather than endure the systematic destruction of their city. This became the template. City after city capitulated not because they couldn't fight, but because the psychological warfare made resistance seem pointless. The Crusaders had also mastered the art of mining. While defenders focused on the visible threat of siege engines, teams of engineers would be digging tunnels beneath the walls. These weren't simple sapping operations. They were complex engineering projects designed to bring down entire sections of fortifications simultaneously. The process was methodical and terrifying. Miners would dig tunnels directly under key structural points of the walls, then fill the excavated spaces with timber supports. When the tunnel network was complete, they would set fire to the wooden supports and retreat. As the timbers burned away, massive sections of wall would collapse catastrophically, creating breaches that heavy cavalry could exploit. The Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097 showcased another dimension of Crusader tactical superiority: adaptability under extreme pressure. When Kilij Arslan's Turkish forces surrounded Bohemon's army at dawn, using their traditional mounted archery tactics, It should have been a massacre. The Turkish strategy was proven and effective. Mounted archers would charge in, loose volleys of arrows, then retreat before the heavily armoured Crusaders could respond. It was a tactic that had broken countless armies throughout the region. The arrows couldn't penetrate knight armour, but they devastated horses and foot soldiers, gradually bleeding the Crusader force to death. Bohemoнд's response demonstrated the tactical flexibility that made Crusader armies so dangerous. Instead of attempting futile cavalry charges against mobile archers, he ordered his knights to dismount. They formed defensive circles, using their shields and armour to protect the vulnerable foot soldiers and non-combatants. The marshy terrain prevented Turkish cavalry charges, creating a stalemate that bought precious time. When Godfrey of Bouillon arrived with reinforcements, the tactical situation reversed completely. Now the Turks found themselves caught between two Crusader forces, unable to use their mobility advantage. The mounted archers who had been picking off Crusaders from a distance suddenly faced heavily armoured knights charging from multiple directions. The Turkish force was annihilated so completely that the Crusaders crossed Anatolia virtually unopposed afterward. This adaptability became a hallmark of Crusader tactics. They could shift from offensive to defensive formations, from mounted to dismounted combat, from siege warfare to open battle, all while maintaining unit cohesion and command structure. Their enemies struggled to predict or counter tactics that could change dramatically based on battlefield conditions. The coastal strategy that followed demonstrated Crusader strategic thinking on a campaign level. Rather than attempting to hold the entire interior of the Holy Land, they systematically captured every major port along the Mediterranean coast. Haifa in 1100, Arsuf in 1101, Tortosa in 1102, Acre in 1104, Tripoli in 1109, and finally Tyre in 1124. This wasn't random conquest. It was a calculated plan to control supply lines and reinforcement routes while denying the same advantages to Islamic forces. By holding the ports, Crusaders maintained direct communication and supply lines with Europe. Their enemies, cut off from naval support, had to rely on overland routes that were vulnerable to Crusader raids and interdiction. The psychological dimension of this strategy was equally important. Each port that fell sent a message to the remaining Islamic strongholds. The Crusaders weren't just occupying territory, they were systematically dismantling the infrastructure that made resistance possible. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Crusader warfare was their use of coordinated deception and misdirection. Medieval chroniclers describe elaborate feints and false retreats designed to draw enemy forces into vulnerable positions. These weren't desperate tactics born of battlefield confusion. They were carefully planned operations that exploited predictable enemy responses. A typical deception might involve a small force of knights appearing to flee in panic, drawing pursuing enemies away from their main formation. When the pursuers were sufficiently isolated and extended, hidden Crusader forces would emerge from concealment to encircle and destroy them. The apparent retreat would suddenly reverse into a devastating counterattack that left enemy commanders questioning everything they thought they knew about Crusader capabilities. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 represents both the peak and the limitation of these tactics when faced with superior strategic leadership. The Crusaders had revolutionized medieval warfare through calculated brutality, technological innovation, and tactical precision that their enemies couldn't match. Their heavy cavalry charges, combined arms coordination, psychological warfare, and siege mastery created a military system so effective it dominated battlefields for 2 centuries. These weren't just holy warriors, they were the architects of destruction who proved that superior tactics, not just superior numbers, determined the outcome of wars. The methods they pioneered would influence military strategy for generations to come.